think we should start. And well, as you see, we were waiting for Istanbul to wake up. And now the lesson we learned is that when you organize an academic event, a group of academics never put Sunday as the second day of the conference. That is bound to be, and especially if the conference is in Istanbul. So it's like that people go out the night before and all that. So, but the great thing is that they're all here, and we can start with our first session planned for today. Now, obviously, we are short of time, so what we are going to do is that in the first keynote sessions, I will ask Matthew Bryza, former US ambassador to Azerbaijan, and Professor Mehmet Asutay from Durham University, to share their reflections for around 10 minutes each. And then we're going to have a Q&A. And I'm planning to wrap this first session just around half an hour. So after that, we can just move to the roundtable as planned. And both Mehmet and Matthew will be part of that roundtable anyway, so you'll be able to hear from them more. But this is really a plenary session and an initial reflection. And both of them are really well qualified to talk about Eurasian politics and society. And it's my great pleasure to invite Matthew for his reflections. And so Matthew, I don't know whether you are going to sit there or stand there.
I guess I'll stand there.
Okay, all right, please.
Sure, thank you. Thanks, Al. And I'm very glad that you have this conference on the second day, because I couldn't come yesterday. I was in Lithuania with my family, a strange place for vacation, but it was very nice. So yeah, I was going to speak about, well, what the title of this section was supposed to be, which is the regional conflicts in the South Caucasus and the role of the so-called great powers. And my background, by the way, is I was in the U.S. Foreign Service for 23 years, and I spent a good piece of that trying to mediate some of the conflicts in the South Caucasus. So that would include, of course, Nagorno-Karabakh, as well as the Abkhazia and South Ossetia conflicts. And so, reflecting on the great powers and who they are in the South Caucasus region in terms of countries that care or have an interest, number one, I'd have to say Russia. Number two, the United States. Number three, the European Union. And then, of course, Turkey and Iran. And the last two have been participating at a much lower level than history would dictate. And I'll come to that in a moment. But I'll start with Russia. Well, what is Russia's interest in the conflicts in the South Caucasus, primarily the two in Georgia, as well as Nagorno-Karabakh? But to answer that question, you have to ask yourself, well, what is the strategic vision of Russia? And it seems quite clear that the vision of Russian and great Russian thinkers is to restore and maintain Russia's great power status. It's a quest for influence, a sense that if you look at the geopolitical map, and there are more colors that are colored in Russia's color, whatever it may be, red, than the other colors, that's good. That's been a traditional Russian perspective. In the Soviet period, we had something called the correlation of forces, right, which was a sense that political, social, military, economic forces globally are moving in the direction of the Soviet Union. So there's a quest for prestige, for influence, simply for the sake of influencing, being able to get your way later when there's a conflict or an issue in place, or leverage to obtain specific political, economic, and security gains. There's also a Russian sense of playing defense in the South Caucasus. Not only defense in terms of a buffer area, but also political defense, and a desire to make sure that the political liberalization movements, particularly in Georgia, the Rose Revolution, doesn't find its way into Russia and weaken, undermine President Putin's non-democratic regime. So the primary, if that's the strategic vision, if those are, and then what I described are the intermediate goals, leverage, control, sense of influence, but really great power status, the primary tactic that Russia has used in managing or not managing its conflicts has been to keep those conflicts simmering, not boiling over, not exploding, but also never being solved. And I'll come back to that in a little more detail maybe in about 4 minutes. The U.S., on the other hand, in my experience in foreign policy as a practitioner, really generally lacks a grand strategy. I know here we were talking about, in fact, over tea just now at the end, questions here, if you live here, you think, oh my gosh, why is the U.S. and why are its allies always disrupting events in this part of the world? Doesn't the U.S. and don't the Europeans seek somehow to weaken Turkey to prevent it from becoming an even greater power? My answer is no, absolutely not. There is no grand strategy like that in the United States. U.S. foreign policy is based on a desire essentially to resolve individual problems in the world. You jump in, jump out once the problem is either fixed or unfixable, with just a vague notion that the world is better, therefore Americans are better if the world is more peaceful, and if our friends in the world are economically prosperous, and if there is an increase in political and economic freedom. It may sound naive or hard to believe, but that in my experience, is truly the way U.S. foreign policy proceeds. Even though in the modern era we come up way short, even though U.S. interventions in its own hemisphere have seemed quite different from what I just described, in the U.S., in the Western Hemisphere, and under the Monroe Doctrine, of course, U.S. foreign policy sounded a lot like what I described with regard to Russian foreign policy in the South Caucasus, a desire for control, great power status, defense, keep the Europeans out. That view that I just articulated is not one that's recognized very widely in the U.S. government, not one that would be popular if I were to have articulated it during one of our policy meetings, but I think it's true. So we generally, though, at least in the South Caucasus, lack and have lacked a strategic vision. We got pulled in to mediation of the conflicts simply by default because the United States was the strongest power. The United States at the time wanted to do whatever it could to make sure that the transition away from the Soviet Union into something new didn't explode. And also the United States had a desire to contain Russia's appetite for great power status because of its view that it's important that the other countries that grew out of the Soviet Union have a chance to determine their own destinies. It's that ideological quest for political and economic freedom. Again, even if the U.S. foreign policy doesn't always live by those standards. Then, when it comes to the European Union, a third of the great powers, also in my dealings in actually mediating on the ground and in a live way, I have never felt that my European colleagues had a strategic vision either. For the European Union in the South Caucasus, the primary goals seem to be, to me, an absence of conflict. So, for sure, no military conflict, and then, if possible, an absence of political conflict, and dialogue. For my European colleagues, often seem to be an end in itself. Dialogue for the sake of dialogue. As long as the parties are speaking to each other, they're not shooting each other, and that's a good thing. And I actually found that a maddening approach in circumstances like when Russia invaded Georgia, and instead of saying this is wrong, this needs to be turned back, it's a violation of international law, my European colleagues were often saying, oh, but let's not talk about that. Let's just get the two sides to have a dialogue. And if you just have a dialogue, after another state commits a violent violation of international law, you freeze that new situation in place. That is not just, and it's not, to me, not in the national security interests of the United States, of our allies, our European allies, or of the states themselves. So the primary tactic of the EU in the South Caucasus, in terms of the conflicts, has been to pursue dialogue. And then they came along with the Eastern Partnership initiative, which I am a big supporter of. I don't think it's done much, except in the case of Georgia, where the reality of visa-free travel and a closer association with the European Union really does motivate people, and really has helped sustain transformational reforms in Georgia that many observers like myself thought had died with the passage of the previous government and then the beginning of the Georgian dream and Mr. Ivanishvili's quirky way of running things. But I think in the case of Georgia, the Eastern Partnership has provided a powerful motivating factor for Georgia to change for the better. When it comes to Azerbaijan and Armenia, I think the Eastern Partnership has had no impact. No impact at all, really, as far as I can see in Armenia, because there is no prospect for visa-free travel or for Armenia really charting its own foreign policy course away from Russia. And in Azerbaijan, the Azerbaijanis, for quite some time, have felt that the Eastern Partnership, which has a fundamental premise of you get more benefits and closer relationship to the EU if you do more on reform, so more for more. The Azerbaijanis have found that to be unpalatable and somewhat patronizing and insulting. And so actually the EU has changed its own approach to Azerbaijan and the Eastern Partnership, and now no longer talks about more for more, but now it's saying, okay, let's pursue a more equal partnership. What I'm trying to say is, even when it comes to the EU's policy of Eastern Partnership, which reflects some sort of a vision, when it comes to Azerbaijan, the EU has dropped the strategic part and is accommodating the preferences of Azerbaijan. And for me, with my Azerbaijan hat, I'm happy about that. When it comes to Turkey and its conflicts, to me, it seems that Turkey's strategic vision is also similar to that of Russia and the United States in the Western Hemisphere, to preserve its presence, to restore a sense of grandeur, of influence. Always in the back of the minds of my Turkish colleagues was a reminder that Turkey is a guarantor of the Treaty of Kars, right? The 1922 Treaty of Kars, based on the Treaty of Moscow, 1921, which defined the borders in the South Caucasus and Turkey's eastern border to this day. A little bit complicated in that none of the signatories to either the Treaty of Moscow or the Treaty of Kars exist. I mean, it was a pre-Bolshevik Russia in 1921 that signed, and it was the Grand National Assembly of Turkey that signed the Treaty of Kars. It wasn't the Sultan at the end of his time, and it wasn't yet the Turkish Republic. So there are questions about the legal continuation of the Treaty of Kars that are raised by Armenian nationalist radicals, the Dashnaks. But Georgia, Azerbaijan, Turkey, Russia have all recognized the Treaty of Kars. Armenia has not. So essentially that is the reality. And so Turkey recalls in its foreign policy that it has this guarantor's role of the Treaty of Kars. But in my experience has never been able to turn that legal reality into action, precisely because in the case of Nagorno-Karabakh, Turkey is frozen out of the negotiations because of all the issues with Armenia in 1915, etc. So Turkey is left to fall back on a tactic of strongly supporting Azerbaijan, providing support to Georgia as well. I mean, Azerbaijan, by the way, has really relied on Turkey in moments of great tension, even with the show of Turkish Air Force. It was supposedly an air show, but you remember that like in 1999 or 2000 when the Iranians sent a gunboat to harass a seismic ship that was doing researching oil prospects in the Caspian Sea. It was Turkey who sent aircraft that really reassured the Azerbaijanis during the air show. But that doesn't provide an opening for Turkey to have a strategic impact. Turkey is able to play a tactical role and prop up Azerbaijan and try to do something strategic back in 2009. And I was absolutely in the middle of it, which was the so-called protocols with Armenia and the attempt to restore, normalize Turkish-Armenian relations, which would have been at the expense of Azerbaijan, but from my position where I was the mediator on Karabakh, I had the overall foreign policy brief for our relations with the South Caucasus and Turkey. I believe there was a way to bring all these pieces together. If there would have been, it could have been that there would have been a contingent approval of the protocols, Turkey-Armenian protocols, on a breakthrough in the Nagorno-Karabakh process. And that was underway and ultimately fell apart for a number of reasons, but mostly I think because the new administration, the Obama administration that I worked under for a while, decided to break that explicit link, and it led to the Armenian side changing its approach to Nagorno-Karabakh. We can go into that in more detail if you have questions or in the question and answer system. I know I'm already over my time. And Iran, to this point, it hasn't really been a player at all in the South Caucasus conflict. Right? Nobody has wanted Iran in. Nobody's wanted it to play a role. It helps Armenia with energy supplies. There's some trade as well. Helps Azerbaijan to gain access to Nakhchivan, its exclave. I mean, Iran does, but otherwise Iran hasn't played a strategic role. So the last couple of points. To illustrate Russia's role of using conflict, right, to keep the area off balance, to maintain its control, look at what happened in Georgia. We can also look at Ukraine today. But in Georgia, for years, beginning, well, in the mid-90s even, right? Russia was playing a role to keep Georgia off balance, supporting Abkhaz separatists. And you all remember the famous case in about 93, I think it was, a Russian fighter bomber, or a fighter bomber was shot down at the Abkhaz Air Force, and who parachuted out of the plane? That guy survived, a Russian pilot, right? So that was just a sign of how involved the Russian military was in Abkhazia from the mid-90s. Beginning in the early 2000s, Russia played an active role, not yet military, to support Abkhaz and South Ossetian separatism. So you may recall that the Russians passportized the residents of Abkhazia, South Ossetia, made them citizens of Russia if they wanted it. It enabled the illegal trade and smuggling through the Roki Tunnel into South Ossetia, which made it impossible for the then Shevardnadze government to enact economic reforms that were required to stabilize Georgia. It also, at one point, recognized the decrees of Abkhazia, South Ossetia as carrying legal force. So, in other words, it was a tacit way to suggest maybe these were independent states. And that kept going and going and going until eventually we had the Bucharest NATO summit, where the U.S. was pushing very hard to give Georgia a clear path toward NATO membership through the Partnership for Peace. And our European allies, especially the Germans, said no. It was Angela Merkel herself at Bucharest who blocked Georgia being able to get a membership action plan, as well as Ukraine. And the outcome of that summit was exactly what was needed by President Putin, in fact, to feel a need to act militarily. What the outcome was that Georgia and Ukraine are not yet members of NATO, or they will be members of NATO eventually once they implement all the necessary reforms. So what NATO was saying was, Mr. Putin, if you don't act soon, it's going to be too late. Georgia is going to make it into NATO, and there'll be nothing you can do, so act now. And so a few months later, 4 months later, he did. People will debate a long time what happened. Did the Georgians provoke, or did the Russians? My take was, after all the years I spent on the conflict, the Russians absolutely provoked the Georgians. The Russians began the shooting based on the intelligence I was receiving at the time. The Georgians were insufficiently strategic to withhold their fire, and then they launched a major counterattack, and that led to an open war. The counterattack, of course, was on Skin Valley in South Ossetia, and then the Russians came in full force into both Abkhazia and South Ossetia. So that was an example of Russia using conflicts, creating tension, getting them to almost to a boiling point, but then stopping. And what they did was freeze Georgia in place, prevent Georgia from becoming on the path to NATO accession, to protect the great power vision of Russia, maintain defense, prevent an important neighbor or bordering state from becoming a member of NATO, maintain a sense of involvement and influence in great power status, because it was Russia that decided the war would begin and ended it. Russia continues to occupy South Ossetia and Abkhazia and remains in control and has effectively blocked Georgia's accession to NATO. Last point is, I remember I was with Professor McFarland at Ditchley. We were just talking about it a couple of years ago at a conference, and he was the only person, besides me, at that time, a U.S. official, vehemently arguing that what the European Union had decided was not legally tenable or historically tenable. Our European allies had agreed with the Russian argument that no state should be able to obtain membership in NATO or the European Union as long as it had an unresolved territorial dispute with a neighbor. Russia created the territorial dispute. It invaded Georgia, right? It occupied its territory. And then we in the West were saying, well, because of that, Georgia can't possibly join NATO because it hasn't resolved this internal territorial question. But many members of NATO have internal territorial questions, or some do. Canada does, Quebec, Spain does, right? With Catalonia. And there are others that are bubbling out there. So that was always a red herring to me, in a case where, again, the European Union had potential to play a strategic role. It decided not to. The United States wasn't sufficiently engaged, didn't care enough really to push, believed Saakashvili was a little bit off balance. And we just let the situation drift to the point that we have today, which is not one that's stable, which is one where Russia can still continue to stir the pot, where none of these issues are resolved, And it all happens at a point where the US president has no foreign policy experience, no knowledge about foreign policy, therefore no real ambitions, and really no curiosity about it as well. So I'm an optimist at heart, but this is a really frightening time for people who care about foreign policy in this part of the world. And I haven't even talked about Nagorno-Karabakh, but I'll stop now. I'm over time, and I think that situation is even more pessimistic. For that one, all I'll say about Karabakh is we're in stasis. Nothing's going to move. The only way things will move would be if, miraculously, the U.S. and Russian presidents decided this issue is at the top of our agenda, and we're going to do something. And the U.S. president would say, if Russia, you don't really do something to resolve this conflict, there'll be a price to pay, which is never going to happen. Or if there was renewed warfare and somebody won, which I don't believe is possible. I don't believe either side can win militarily. I mean, I honestly don't believe that. I'm not just saying like John Kerry used to say, oh, there is no military solution to a conflict. I mean, every conflict, and as we know from Clausewitz, war is a continuation of politics by other means. So ultimately, every military conflict has to come to a political conclusion. But in the case of Karabakh, there's no way to win on the ground militarily. So the third option is that drift until people either no longer care as much, sort of like on Cyprus, where people aren't ready to kill each other anymore, even though it's still a maddening conflict, or one side or the other grows so weak that they simply have to acquiesce to somebody else's solution. Thank you.
I guess it's still sleeping or having breakfast. Sunday morning breakfast, just lounging and enjoying something in the stomach, which I often enjoy as well, which has consequences for academic activities. Well, being late, it made my life easier because most of the things that I want to discuss, we had a chat over just a cup of tea, and that made my life easier now to summarize it in 10 minutes or so. What I want to do here, those of you familiar with my work, is I work on moral economy, and mainly focus on Islamic moral economy. Moral economy in the sense of aligning discourse, and however, I have been expanding this notion of moral economy, adding to that the whole concept of power of shame, not in terms of shaming people, but how it can be instrumentalized in terms of essentializing the consequentialist aspect of moral economy, and then how that can be structured through radical democracy that we have as a debate around us. So this is the first time I thought I could try it with the audience coming from a multidisciplinary background, but unfortunately that was not possible. I had a PowerPoint presentation, but we missed it. So what I put the title of my presentation is responding to hegemony through essentializing moral economy, and therefore looking at political economy on the one side, how political economy shapes moral economy, then looking at power of shame as a content of that process, a facilitated process of moral consequences, and embedding decisions within the social formation of societies in which moral economy operating, and then coupling that how moral economy outcomes. And when I say moral, of course, everyone might immediately jump to the religion as an issue, but moral economy does not necessarily directly refer to a particular religion. Or for that matter, religion, secular or humanistic ethics, of course, they have their morality. And for that matter, for instance, I'm very heavy critics of Islamic banking and finance we have in relation to this morality, because it works as part of the market economy rather than essentializing the moral economic consequences of Islamic normality. And then looking at the radical democracy, how it can. So those of you, I don't know how many of you are familiar with these concepts, but I'll try my best in 10 minutes to go through them. And as I put in my title is the hegemony. Hegemony is something that I'm looking at how with the neoliberal policies, whether in economics, politics, and society, how the shifts have taken in different societies and the convergence between different societies have been taking place. In the next session, we'll be talking about civilization and civilizational the conflicts or the convergences between civilization, but beyond that, beyond civilizations, neoliberalism, of course, imposes itself. Wherever you are, in a small village in Africa to Southeast Asia and Istanbul, wherever you are, that hegemony is there. But of course, that creates a particular tension in societies. And this interest I have developed because one of the multilateral institutions approached me. They told me that, look, we have this project, we want you to involve because you have been working on Islamic moral economy. Why, they asked me, Islamic social movements, when they are social movements, when they are in the periphery in their countries, they're very much welfare-oriented, moral economy-oriented, the good society-oriented. But when they come to power, wherever they are, they unfortunately immediately become neoliberals. Okay, and then they become heavily restructuring the society according to their rules, regardless of that good society. I mean, that's a very interesting question because we have seen in this country as well how the Islamically oriented, whatever the term we use, government in power over the last 15 years or so, but heavily neoliberal government, heavily commodifying, as we were discussing just now, heavily commodifying the social services in the society. Even looking at your parents now, government will give you the money. Okay, so that commodification is taking place. And my interest, therefore, developed out of that, in particular, looking at moral economy within the context of political economy, politics, and international political economy, and therefore how I can move it. So therefore, I consider moral economy as a counter-hegemony, in the sense that embedding again. So rather than accepting the neoliberal norms, regardless of whatever your norms are, I mean, it might be very normal and acceptable, perhaps, although politely would disagree with that, in a particular society where market determines everything, the social relations as well. Commodification perhaps is acceptable, neoliberalism is acceptable, but it is going all over the world, changing the social formation of society. So societies are formed and regulated according to neoliberal policies around market. So therefore, looking after your mother, the elderly mother, has to be arranged within that context as well. That you get the money is a commodified issue rather than a graphic to your parents, for instance. As it is happening around us. And therefore, moral economy I look at as a counter-hegemony, as a response to the neoliberal hegemonic position. And therefore, how society's structures, the social formation of society has been affected, and therefore how it has been disembedded from the realities of the society, whether in economics, whether in politics, whether in society. That's this embeddedness and disembeddedness debate is important to understand what moral economy is. And therefore, what we have around us, yes, perhaps civilizations were there and happened, but with the huge conversion imposed by neoliberalism, you have one particular social formation wherever you go. Okay, whether you're in the streets of Kuala Lumpur, you buy the same things, you act in the same manner, whether you're in New York or Istanbul, and etc. So therefore, it created a disembeddedness. So the social formation of those societies no longer have any impact of how society is organized. Because of the neoliberal impositions. And the tensions, we have tensions in this country, in other countries, that created a tension. In this country, of course, the government is using certain civil society, we call them, to moderate the consequences. On the one hand, they're very careful not to increase the minimum wage to beyond certain level. On the other hand, they have been using all those different boxes and places, such as beautiful buildings, such as this, to give out so that moderate the consequences of neoliberal policies. Despite the fact that most of them in the power in this country, they come from very humble backgrounds. Okay, So because there is this embeddedness created with the liberal policies, unfortunately they do not recall their background and hence the importance of the social formation of the societies in which they have been brought up and they have been raised. And therefore, looking at moral economy as a consequence, how moral economic consequences are important in shaping the societies, individual behavior, but the societies as well, and how civil society, therefore, and the normative aspects of society has to be embedded, or the economy, society, politics, what we have, has to be embedded within the social formation of a particular society so that people's voices can be heard. And that is very much so. Moral economy is not only an economic issue, but it goes beyond that how society is organized. And therefore, it's very much an emancipation and empowerment relationship. How political economies can be created so that the individual emancipation and empowerment can be achieved. As I mentioned, I had a presentation to debate all this. I'm in the learning process as well, but I wanted to share with you. Time is an issue, therefore I'm going to summarize the issues for you. So the whole idea with moral economy is embedded society. So economic relations is not only determined by economic factors, but social relations and the normative nature of that society determines. And hence, economy is part of the social formation of that particular society. And it organically emerges, rather than like in neoliberalism, it is imposed on the society. Like market has always been the reality of human beings. But market exchange is different than the market system. Market system has a particular implications of how to organize society as opposed to just the market exchange. So moral economy, therefore, is very much looking at the social goods, how social goods can be created in the society, and how the normative nature and the morality of a particular society determines that. And therefore, a fairer society, a society in which everything embedded within that particular social formation of that particular society. So it is embeddedness, therefore, in a Polanyi's great contribution. Those of you who have interest in international politics and political economy, Polanyi's contribution is very much important for us. And when we look at perhaps one of the people who have been working on Polanyi is Ayşe Bura from Boğaziçi University as well. She has immensely contributed to that, and how Polanyi criticized the market economy. As opposed to what Polanyi said that societies were submerged. Everything was part and parcel of that particular society, how a society determined how economy and the politics and political economy should be. So social relationships or a general structure of a society determine everything, including the economy. Okay, and therefore the embeddedness. However, he would say the emergence of self-regulated market created this embeddedness. So market system is no longer benefits from the social formation of its society, okay, because it has its own law of the market, not necessarily directly benefiting the moral consequences of a particular society, so it is not organic. It hasn't emerged organically from a particular society in which it's operating, okay, and therefore non-contractual social relations is not considered. So the market is very much contractual, very much rational law determines the whole process. The ethics doesn't play any role. So if you have it, if you do not have it, you don't have it. So it is not an organic forms of existence. It is imposed. And therefore, such as trust, reciprocity, kinship, neighborhood, creed, and etc. doesn't play a particular role in the self-regulated market economy. And therefore, this detachment from the normative value of a society and how society is organized. Okay? And this is something that I have been criticizing in the Western democracies as well, because that's this attachment, this embeddedness created a huge difficulty between the ruled who goes to the elections only, and it's only 35, 40, 50%, and the policy is established at the top. This embeddedness, unfortunately, the public policy is entirely disembedded with the realities of society. Therefore, the moral economy is very much aiming to re-embed society. We embed the economic, the social, political structure into the realities of that society, and hence create this submergence, and how it can be articulated in a different phrase. But as Polanyi would say, moral economy is very much the embeddedness is important, the commodification. So anything that we have around us slowly is being commodified. As I mentioned, like in the society, looking after your parents is something has to be praised. That's a duty. But now you have to, the government is giving you money, is commodifying that, okay? And creating fictitious commodities, values of morality in shaping the normativeness, the importance of redistribution, reciprocity, community and charity, convention and coordination, the mutuality, collective action. So these are not only charity, you are not doing a charity, but you are organizing the society within the normative form of that society. Such as here, as I mentioned, charity has been heavily utilized to moderate the consequences of market economy, but this has to be structured in order to bring such consequences. And as I mentioned, it's not only this morality refers to religion, it can be religion, but the consequences are important. What consequences are produced that we can call as moral? The story is rather long. I have been trying to develop the ideas, but there are, Polanyi would say that the past economies, the past societies were moral societies until the emergence of market economy, okay, self-regulated market. And therefore, he would say that the institutions that emerged in the 20th century, okay, such as trade unions, like in this society, the Islamic groups and etc., all these charities and etc., they aimed at moderating the consequences of a self-regulated market economy. What he used the words rescuing land, labor, and capital. That has been the objective of social movements, you would say. And that facilitated the impact, the adverse impact of capitalism in the society, moderating the consequences in a way, etc. And coming to the next stage, the applications, like from this area, perhaps within this building, it was experimented in the past, the guild system that we had, and the Muslim lands, for instance, is very much organized around moral economies, such as ahilik system, the brotherhood system, in which each sector, whether it's the shoemakers, whether the bread makers, and etc., they had their own organization, a guild. Around guild, they have organized that moral economy, how the society organized around. There are quite a number of studies on ahilik or brotherhood, but unfortunately they are very much nationalistically oriented, futuhat and etc., but not necessarily on the moral economy issue. An important part, I wish I had time to go through that, but an important part of that was the self-regulating nature of morality. So a person fails to produce a shoe, a pair of shoes, according to the standards, you would feel that in the morning when it comes to the shop that the shoe, of course, is just hanging around that was enough for that person to leave that city. The power of shame was important. Of course, power of shame can be very dangerous thing at the same time. As we have seen in recent literature, a lot of questions raised of humiliating. But the power of shame I'm referring is not in terms of dignity and humiliation, in terms of empowering individual against the hegemony. Quite a number of literature has been produced, such as looking at the gay rights and etc. in terms of shaming and the negative impact of it. My reference to power of shame is not within that context, but rather than essentializing the or positioning individual against the hegemony, and how therefore when we look at historically, the power of shame has been amazingly powerful instrument against the tyrant. And also when I look at myself, I was just talking to a colleague, such as, I see you have a person who has a fantastic discourse on human rights and this and that, but it's very sectorial. I mean, I was looking into Myanmar and I was looking at the Rohingya Muslims, how they struggle, how they proceed, and you have a leader here who was in prison or secluded from society for so many years. Now she's one way or another in power in Myanmar, and when it comes to the Muslim issue, she wouldn't say anything. In the same manner, we have in a number of countries, including in this country, such as everyone is very reactive when it comes to Palestinian issue or Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar, but when it comes to Kurdish issue, they can be very, very conservative. And therefore, their discourses and their actions doesn't fit. And therefore, the power of shame is very much related to that gap, and therefore the moral economy. Because as part of that moral consequences, it's expected that gap should be reduced. And power of shame, they were saying that, look guys, this is not acceptable, whatever your political position. And the distinction of the power of shame is very much related with scale. Because as opposed to guilt, the power of shame is that it can scale. It can work against the entire countries. It can be used by the weak against the strong. And however, guilt, on the other hand, is just very much operates entirely within individual psychology. So the normativeness of the power of shame is an important issue to consider, such as you cannot perhaps argue guilt as an important motivation factor for Wall Street on the road to the banking reform, but Occupy Wall Street or the rhetoric of the one person shaming campaign is an important tool, an instrument to essentialize the morality of the society and say that, look, this is wrong. So therefore, the moral economy outcomes, whether in social, economic, or political spheres, is very much related of not fulfilled promises. It's very much the power of shame, therefore, is no longer there, and therefore it is essential. Now, the issue, of course, we can provide plenty of examples, but how do we achieve that? And structurally, because it's very much civil society oriented, and I love it. But on the other hand, when I talk about this, immediately, state and etc. comes to the question. And that brought me to the issue of radical democracy as opposed to the instrumental democracy that we have around us. As Laclau and Mouffe in their book Hegemony and Socialist Strategy towards a Radical Democracy, it appealed to me that this can be merged into a particular model, because the what I call is the instrumental democracy that we have around us is very much try to establish consensus. Most of the time, it's very much imaginary society, try to create an imaginary society, establish a consensus at the expense of others, and oppress different opinions, races, ethnicities, class, genders, and worldviews, and etc. Because mainstreaming, trying to bring something. And therefore, radical democracy, however, is a current practice of democratic political contestation. In other words, differences has to be negotiated and has to be internalized. Okay? Not integrated, but internalized in the decision-making process. So the different voices can be heard, and therefore, and that is very much the whole idea of creating an embedded society that moral economy tells us. So it is contemporary, when we look at the contemporary democracy, as I call instrumental democracy, it's very much on aggregation or accommodation of various identities and interests. However, radical democracy very much looks at how these are permanently contested in ways that transform them as they combine and recombine in the wide heat of political action. And therefore, rather than just consultation and participation in political decision-making, the theory and practice of radical democracy would emphasize the process of conflict and disagreement and appreciates that as a social capital in expanding the nature of the society and how society operates in a very organic manner. So moral economy is a very much organic. It refers to the embeddedness of society, and structuring that is very much the radical economy I create very essentially fits into that process. And therefore, looking at how consensus and resolution can be an important instrument of extending democracy beyond the structured way that we have around us, so that we can overcome this oppressiveness of the power relations that exist in societies, whether in the economic sphere, social sphere, or political spheres, that is oppressive to people who are not fitting into this instrumental democracy and the moral economy. Therefore, the whole idea is to renegotiate and accept those differences rather than mainstreaming them, so that the voices can be heard in a very much embedded sense rather than imposing a particular superstructure on the rest of society. In other words, hearing the base, let the base talk, and so that the differences can be heard and can be internalized in decision making. So it is a disruptive tool in reshaping the society, in the same way that moral economy is a disruptive economic understanding as opposed to hegemony. And therefore, when I look at how moral economy, the power of change, and radical democracy can fit together from the micro to macro, we establish a particular way of looking at how society can be or should be organized. This, and as I mentioned, is an exercise that I have been going through, reflecting on what is going around us, and looking at all these broken promises, the disloyalties, and etc. I think it is essential that the voices of the ordinary people should be heard. Because what we see, we have seen, like in this country as well, the imams going on the Friday sermons and saying that even strikes is forbidden in Islam, etc. How neoliberalism determines, therefore, even the discourses of religion, and this is not accepted, therefore, how essentialization of moral economy in an organic sense, and how that can be perhaps articulated in radical moral economy is essential. I hope I tried my best to summarize what I wanted to say. Thank you very much, sir. I rushed you through, but hopefully we can debate such matters in future events or today, including today. Thank you very much.
Right. Wow. I think you would agree that we had a fantastic journey this morning with our two keynote presenters, and I will not even attempt to summarize what they said, and because both of them had, they looked at some of these political and societal issues within Eurasia from different angles. But I think the significance of, for me, that what they said with Professor Asutay, it was almost like a conceptual journey. You really brought up so many interesting issues that are significant and really almost like that matters for many societies in Eurasia. And the societies really need to tackle with those matters, and the issues of hegemony and the country hegemony, and within that, how that space needs to be negotiated between the state and civil society. So much there that we packed in a very short span of time. Thank you very much. And it was a delightful kind of academic experience of like 15-20 minutes, and bringing all that together for us. And similarly, it was another delightful journey with Matthew. And isn't it fantastic to hear about foreign policy matters from somebody who actually did all this on the ground? And your experience of like saying, oh, well, actually, when I was in South Caucasus, I was on the ground in mediating this process. It's just such a wonderful a privilege, really, to hear this from somebody who did it on the ground, and thank you so much to both of you. I would love to open the floor for Q&A, but this is my suggestion. Now, because we are going to have a roundtable, and both Mehmet and Matthew will be part of that roundtable, why don't you keep your questions to that session? So all I will ask now is just 2 minutes so that we can reorganize the stage, so we can ask the roundtable members to join us. And then, as part of that, you could ask your specific questions from their presentations. So I think it's a fair deal, I suppose, with the time. Okay, thank you very much to both of you. Jones and Neil and Grandma Jones.
Sorry, that's great. Please hold on. I guess we can start. You have to put the second one. Okay, in this session, I don't know whether we'll be able to facilitate questions after my and Matthew's session, but if we have, we'll be happy to respond. But the main objective is the colleagues thought that talking about civilization and the world politics, the impact or the causality between the two, and how one is shaping if there is any. Of course, the debate, I use civilization analysis in looking at how economic trajectories of the world has developed since the centuries. But at the same time, I'm very cautious about using civilization. It's a very general term, the meaning, the implication, the articulation of civilization. But of course, Samuel Huntington's paper, I think, alerted all of us that we should look into civilization. And therefore, in a number of countries, including in Turkey, and institutional attempts to creating institutions looking at the civilization dialogue. I think it's wrong. Look, guys, we are dialoguing civilization alliances in United Nations level, Turkey, Spain, and all those stories. But at the same time, of course, strangely enough, Islam has become an important debatable issue whether the Islamic civilization has always. But of course, that is not only limited with Huntington. Even when we look at the very understanding of how society is organized, again, you would see that there's the West, there's the East, and then of course post-colonial discourses on such matters, looking at the constructing the colonial views of the Eurocentricity of looking at the rest of the world. But one way or another, civilization perhaps is something that we really have to deconstruct and look into what it is and the impact of that. We have colleagues here, I think we have met, so I'm not going to go through to introduce them with the permission they have been around. We want to look at what those issues are. Of course, when it comes to mind, can we talk about civilization? Perhaps they were running a position, but since we were talking just now, I'll start with from absolutely right, President. Can we talk about civilization as a unit of analysis in whether it's economics, sociology, politics, world politics, whether they play a role or they are playing? What would be your responses?
Thank you very much.
The microphone is there.
It's a difficult question. Because then we start to talk about civilization or civilizations. But even in Turkey,
If you could be short so that we can go all around and discuss the issues.
Yes. Yes. And it is good now, in just a few years ago, when we say civilization, but only one civilization embodied in the Western civilization. I think one favor Mr. Huntington did, he said, no, there is not one civilization. There are many civilizations, and some of them, they are still have an effect in our social, as you said, in moral economy, political life, in our political life, moral life, and in our daily life. And Islam is one of them. So when I just attended another summit in Berlin last week, they asked me, before the summit, the G20 summit this week in Hamburg, what religion can say about some major problems in the world. They asked me the same, what Islamic civilization can say, for example, about sustainable development. What Islam can offer, for example, Islamic values. When we look at this in the civilization level, we look at the history, how Islam deals with inequality problem in the society, which is one of the major modern problems. As you remember, Sir Anthony Atkinson, in his last book, he says the major and the greatest problem in the world and the West, especially in the U.S., is inequality problem. And this is why President Trump, his first executive was to cancel Obamacare, and still it's a big issue in the Congress, a big issue in the American society. How we will build inequality problem in society when it comes to health issues. Let's forget the other issues, it's health problems. So when I look at, we have, before that we have Muslim scholars, they were meeting in Kuala Lumpur to talk about this 2 years ago, because there's some concrete sustainable development goals by UN, 17. There's 17 items we have to deal with them. The first is how we can eradicate poverty, how we can overcome poverty, how we can help the people who are, don't, have anything to survive. With the capitalist mentality, you don't have, it is clear, capitalism cannot overcome this. And this is why we have we coined the term, the sustainable development, because the present system, economically, socially, even politically, is not sustainable in many places of the world. This is one of the major causes of the international and domestic terrorism too, because there's unsustainable systems, economic, as you said very well, the moral economy. And it reminded me, yes, from Ibn Khaldun to Arnold Toynbee, we know that there are some binding principles, unified principle of civilizations. And in the Islamic civilization, in the East and also in the West, in Andalusia, we can find some principles you also mentioned in your talk, to fill the gap between the poor and the rich, and the wealthy, and also the other part of the society. But in modern Muslim societies, I cannot say Muslim countries because it's very problematic. Muslim societies, when we revitalize this principle, it's not easy. In the public level, it is good. For example, last week it was Ramadan. We observed the Ramadan. In the Ramadan, as we said before, ahilik, in the Ramadan you can't see the spirit of the people. Since the Muslims at the bottom level of the society, they are helping each other, because experientially They know what the hunger is, what is to be thirsty, what is to be deprived from the food and eating all the day, 18 hours, sometimes 20, 19 hours. So we can see this in the Muslim society, at least for a month. All society there was trying to help needy people, poor people. There was a lot of help, even between rich and just a businessman. He told me in private, he's giving 8 million US dollars as a zakat. I said, it is very surprising. Sometimes it says it is 9 million. I said, why it is 9 million? Because after I distribute my zakat, people still apply us for help. If I don't give them, they will say, they will suppose I am not giving my zakat. But it is a private, but we cannot institutionalize it in the modern society. And as you said some concerns about Islamic banking system, why they call Islamic banks. I have also these concerns, and they are, I think, misusing this spirit of Islamic civilization. We have to, even the Pope said, we have to learn from this, Islamic contribution to society. This is why I really, yes, as Mehmet said, sometimes you see people, let's make dialogue for the sake of dialogue. But in my journey, I really met some scholars, some sincere people. They want to learn, they want to share their values. In this respect, we can learn and also share our values, but also learn from them how we can vitalize some unifying and binding and shaping values of Islamic civilization, as you mentioned in your talk. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to come back to that, but the issues you mentioned, how come they are civilizational, how much they are religious, how much it is culture, that's an important question that we will come back.
Yes.
Posing the same question to Professor Marquardt. Can we use civilization as a unit of analysis, whether it's politics, political, economic, society, whatever it is? Is it good enough as a tool for us looking at such as the impact which might have on world politics? I mean, it's a very large concept. When I say Islamic civilization, I mean, when I go to Indonesia, I see Javanese culture. When I come here, it's a very much 35 culture, and etc. The same applies to Western Europe. So having mosques or church doesn't perhaps make a civilization. What would be your response?
Oh, I absolutely agree. I agree with your the slight skepticism reflected in your initial remarks as to the utility of this particular concept in addressing problems in the way of politics. One element of that, as I said yesterday, is that people are not shy to use the term civilization, but they are very shy about defining what it is. I mean, I thought about this last night. Everybody has their own view. My dear mother, may she rest in peace, when she was really angry at me, she would say, "You're uncivilized."
Yes.
Yeah.
What's the meaning?
Yeah, what does that mean? Well, I know what she meant. Believe me. She meant, this is a slightly different word, rude, okay, or bad. But what is it? To me, probably if we could get a definition that most people would agree on, it would be something surrounding shared norms, values, rules, customs, patterns of social life that are deemed somehow legitimate within the group in question. Does it have to be religious? Well, no. On that definition, no, it doesn't. There can be religious variants. There can be secular or humanist variants, as you suggested earlier. Is it, as Huntington thought in his reminder to us, we need to take this into account, which, by the way, I disagree with, is it geographical? Can you draw a map of civilizations? Anybody walking down the streets of Toronto this afternoon would have to say no, because it is, Toronto is a large city comprising representatives of about, depending on how you define it, 25, 50, 100 different civilizations. So we have, what do we have? A civilization of civilization? I'm confused. Now, as for world politics, when we think about action or relevance in world politics, we think about agents using instruments to achieve outcomes. So that traditionally this involved states or groups of states using power. In this case, civilization can be a form of power. The appeal to civilization can have an influence. We, with great respect, as always to that, we talked about American foreign policy in Caucasus reflecting a commitment to economic liberalism, I think, free markets, democracy, and human rights. I mean, I think that's what you more or less, but we're definitely on the same page. Now, that is an appeal to a set of arguably civilizational norms, but the question would be, whose norms are these? For example, I would be interested if hypothetically you were having a conversation with your president on each of those three categories, except possibly economic liberalism. But what he means there really is plutocracy. If we think about the American population as presumably somehow sharing this civilization, which embraces effectively American value-based universalism. What about probably the near majority or majority of the American population who figures America is too involved in this? It doesn't work. We need to focus on stuff at home. And if these other people want to go to hell in a handbasket, let them. I mean, I'm really troubled about how, as effectively an empirical social scientist, I'm troubled, A, about how you clarify concepts, and B, about how you operationalize them in research.
Thank you very much for your take. I will share the skepticism that I have as I get rid of analysis and what is and where is civilization. Of course, I'm going to turn to Professor Marchan, right? I consider Konya is considered to be an important center of so-called Islamic civilization. Rome is there, was a capital city, played an important role. And reflecting, of course, in a post-Huntington positioning, and Turkey became an important stakeholder and the civilization alliances. But perhaps just reflect on the same question, whether it is something that you, coming from a different background, believe that civilization should be a link of analysis. And then perhaps looking at these all civilization alliances that have been created, and it seems that we have done it, but some reflections on it.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for your compliments about my hometown. And especially, I really felt privileged hearing this, and when we have come to this conference hall before starting the conference, I have noticed that it really looks like the Mevlana Museum in Konya, because at the last instance, both of them are the places of Mevlevi religious order. And the cells next to here, opposite to here, right now the administrative offices, previously they were the dervish cells. And it really keeps this essence. Anyone who knows about the religious food and the location of this dervish cells also in Konya, but it has been a religious brotherhood location, then it has become a museum. So it really changed all its essence. It doesn't make sense for the tourists if you are not interested in. So
through your question, when it comes to how shall we take civilization as a unit of analysis, my main question is, rather than can we take it, I would like to add how can we do it. If your scope of analysis is world politics, then civilization is really a good unit of analysis. But we have to specify it, we have to take its scope and how shall we use it in a functional way, then we have to question that. For example, let's take Western civilization, quote unquote. To some extent, yes, it's quite through its secular notions, I find it quite pagan too, on one sense, very for fun. But on the other hand, through reading Maria Todorova's book about the Balkans, and at the end of her book, she says that there is no one single Western civilization. Because at the same time, even if you take the same era, at the one hand you see the liberal variants as well as the fascist or totalitarian, authoritarian understandings at the philosophical level or at the governmental level. We cannot say that Adolf Hitler and German Nazism or Italian fascism, also they are part of this Western civilization. So we have to take our scope either era or geographical. And also, as you have mentioned, when you take Islamic civilization, if you take Jakarta, as you have mentioned, I would take it, or Java culture, and also when it comes to the Turkic culture, not just, I'm not talking about Turkey, as a person who has lived 2 years in Kyrgyzstan, in Bishkek, and 2 years in Almaty, and also besides the geographical locations, also the understanding which was shaped in post-Soviet and especially the Soviet culture has really integrated and eliminated some of the understanding of Islamic culture to some extent too we have today. So then we can take civilization as a unit of analysis. There is nothing wrong with it. But we should limit our borders about its scope to use it. The second, as you have mentioned through Professor McFarlane's anecdote about his mother, truly that your mother is a civilized person because she called your behaviors as uncivilized. And also she sounds quite diplomatic too. I really appreciated her way of doing it. For example, as a father of a 12 years old boy, sometimes I call my son as cow because he, rather than uncivilized, because he's very barbarian, especially when he's acting against his 6-year-old sister. So please do not blame me calling my son as cow because he really deserves that, and I'm not as diplomatic as your mom. So through these examples, what I want to mean is that when we are talking about civilization, we have to put the other, that all the civilizations put it in order to define themselves. So we should look barbarian also as the unit of analysis. That's the other side of the story. Because there is no barbarian who calls himself as barbarian. Yes, all we are barbarians. And when you take it into the politics issue, I have not seen any terrorist who is calling himself or herself as terrorist. Oh, we are terrorists. Oh, what a fun. No one calls it like that. They call themselves as the bearers of liberty, as the very innocent thing. Right now, as we have talked during the break, for example, the YPG issue, as part of the extension of the PKK for the Turkish government, they are the barbarians in this context of terrorists. When you ask them, well, they are doing their best because they are waging the war against the most known evil of our era, ISIS or Daesh, however you call it. So they find themselves as quite civilized. And when you look at the discourses of Daesh yesterday, as you have given us such a good presentation, I really enjoyed my time and quite informative. And also, they put themselves through waging war against the devil, all of us in this context, for the ISIS. And they want to establish the heaven on earth if you follow their path. So, in this context, through your question, yes, we can take civilization
as the unit of analysis through delineating the borders of its scope, and also we have to keep in mind about the other of civilized and about this barbarian issue. And one more thing, I also find this civilization issue somewhat schizophrenic. I have written, and it's published through as a book chapter by Oxford Press. It really made me happy at the beginning of this year. And let me tell why I find it schizophrenic. It's the anecdote of all the, probably the Turkish citizens who have experienced this Turkish education system. And my article starts with that issue. In every classroom in Turkey, starting from the elementary school to the end of high school in the lycée, you see on the wall the national anthem and Atatürk's ode to the youth. And on the one hand, in the Turkish national anthem, Mehmet has labeled Western civilization in this context as this what you call a civilization is the monster with a remaining one tooth, something very ugly that we have to. On the other hand, when you take the Atatürk's discourse as part of his 10th anniversary of the Republic in 1933, we have to catch up with the contemporary civilization, which is very Western, of course, and also we have to pass. So I really find it schizophrenic in this context. What shall we do with this Western civilization? Shall we follow it, or is it really a monster? And all of us have passed through this schizophrenic, and not just for the Western one. Also, you can take it through the old civilizations, because through taking this politics issue, all the civilizations are based on politics, because it puts the borders on the people's behaviors, and it values that as a good behavior, as a bad behavior. And that is why we call it all civilizations as political. And in this context, when you take the history of the whole all civilization historically, they have dirty clothes on their wardrobes. For example, when you take, let's say, Roman civilization, exactly in military terms, in architectural terms, the Colosseum in Rome, it's giant, and it's still very good, but it needs reparation, I think. Probably Party municipality can do it very well, and also there were some caps about it. That's why I'm talking about it. And when you look at this Colosseum, the next thing that comes to our mind that the slaves were trying their best in order to keep themselves alive vis-a-vis lions. So is it civilization on the? It's also quite barbarian that we have to keep in. Or for today, when you take this Western civilization, let's take United States or British, since they are here, what they are doing to the whole world at a very partial level that we have to, and also I asked this question while coming here, why are we disordering our region, the Middle East or Levant? So you can take from this discourse, and at the end of my wording for now, well, it's the barbarian is kept within civilization, and civilization is kept within this barbarian issue, and it could be taken as a unit of analysis in a careful way. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Interesting reflections. I'm more skeptical than a positive attitude towards civilization analysis, but we'll come to that. I'll turn to Tim. Of course, Tim is political economist, so we come from the same background. So how do political economists you look at civilization as a unit of analysis? They think that it is something that you would find it useful in looking at the political economic development around the world, sustainable development. Perhaps we can produce references from Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, and etc. But at the end of the day, it is constructed in a particular way.
Thanks. I think it's been pretty well covered, so I won't take up very long, and I'm sure the audience have questions they'd like to put to us. I mean, for me, the idea of civilization is just kind of bad science, really. It's certainly bad history. It doesn't really have any conceptual value, and it doesn't have any empirical application. I mean, let's look at some of what Huntington said. You know, the idea of European civilization is just, I mean, fairly preposterous, really. Even the word Europe. I mean, who was Europe? Where does the word Europe even come from? Europe was a person. She was a Greek princess, Europa. Where was she born? In Tyre, southern Lebanon, now controlled by Hezbollah. So, you know, even the word doesn't have any meaning for us in northwest Europe. We were living in trees and marrying our sisters there when the eastern Mediterranean was building hospitals and universities. The very notion of a European kind of civilization has its roots not just in the north of the Mediterranean basin, which is what we like to tell ourselves, but actually on the southern and eastern shores. Even Father Christmas was a Turk, right? Bedrock of our Western civilization, key to our shared norms and values, apparently. Exactly, he came from Patara. Yeah, I mean, I don't feel that I have shared values with Theresa May or Nigel Farage just by an accident of birth. Am I civilizationally connected to them? No, thank God. St. Augustine, who, you know, a great patriarch of, probably, you know, one of the key figures in Western ethics, he left behind a 5 million word corpus written with a feather. Where was he born? Where did he work? You ask any British person, they will say, well, he was Greek. Well, yes, he was Greek, but he was born in Algeria. For Greeks, Greek civilization was based in North Africa, and it was based in Turkey. Many of the great Greek masters that we think of lived their entire lives in what we now Turkey. So Turkey isn't a bridge between Western and Eastern civilization. That's just something the tourist board produces. There is no bridge. Turkish civilization is European civilization. There is no difference. What we know as Europe emerged from Turkey and the Arab world from North Africa. There are no clear distinctions here, culturally, that we can use as to create a kind of civilizational block. And it is that which is Huntington's greatest failure, probably. And actually, Huntington never really captured the imagination. He's just a useful tool to give to undergraduates, to teach them critical analysis. Give them something so obviously wrong, and it helps them to develop critical faculties. And really, in policy terms, he never really attracted anything more than the right-wing matters of Glenn Beck and etc. There was a kind of moment in the mid-90s as we approached the end of the millennium, and we all thought that we were planes were going to fall from the sky, and life was not going to continue after 2000 in some way. The Project for the New American Century kind of were attracted to Huntington briefly in 1996-7, Fukuyama, The End of History and The Last Man. That was Huntington's moment. The attacks on Washington and New York in 2001 put paid to any kind of idea that, you know, that we could be in conflict with the Islamic world in some sense. Bernard Lewis, doyen of Western analysis of the East for many, many decades, he's now nearly 100, isn't he? I mean, he made it very clear that Huntington had no value, and he was one of Huntington's main advocates in many ways in the 90s. He made it very clear that actually in the war on terror, we're going to need allies, we're going to need Muslim allies, is what he told the State Department. So really Huntington's kind of grand canvas has no real policy value either to the West. The West needed to engage and to find what Mandani calls the good Muslim to work with. And that really is very counter to this kind of mass kind of generalizations that Huntington offered. So, no, to answer your question, Mehmet, no, I don't think civilization had much value conceptually.
Yes, thank you, Tim. As you mentioned, it is because you are in the same country that doesn't make you part of so-called, what exactly, hegemonic perceived civilization in that part of the world. because you align to certain values, perhaps not necessarily shared by the majority. But hopefully we'll come back to those issues because these are all emerging, important, debatable issues. But going to the real politics, and maybe you come from directly from the real world in the kitchen, making policies, international politics, working in the U.S. Department and ambassador to Azerbaijan. Not only as an American as Azerbaijan, but we have witnessed also what's happening in Central Asia, as you mentioned, the Armenian and the Azerbaijan conflict. And how do you feel whether civilization really plays an important role in the State Department or any foreign departments in terms of unit of analysis, and whether it has any impact on decision making in the foreign offices, so for their politics at the international level?
Thanks very much. Yeah, I think that in the pragmatic world of foreign policy, which is a mix, as Neil was saying, of values and interests, the civilization as a diagnostic tool does not exist. No, I don't know anybody who thinks of civilization as a way to determine policies, because, at least in our education, in my educational experience, we are taught that civilization, or we're taught to think about civilization as sort of a basket of everything good. As you were saying, if you are uncivilized, or as you were saying as well, about barbarians, that which is good is civilized. That which brings wisdom and knowledge and health and prosperity and equality and political freedom, that's called civilization. And so, in my experience, everybody, again, as you were saying, everybody in my circles that was involved with foreign policy thought that what we were doing and what they were doing was for the good of global civilization. The whole idea of globalism is a positive concept in these foreign policy circles of the United States. The notion that capitalism is a distinct civilization that is somehow inherently inferior or meaner than another one doesn't hold water. The way we're taught history, especially, European history, is that everything you were talking about, Mehmet, in your model of civilization, or Islamic civilization, that is a part of quote-unquote Western civilization or European civilization. Equality is supposed to be part of it. I mean, Karl Marx, where's he from, right? I mean, he's from Trier, but he wrote and was influenced by Manchester, by the Mills. His strongest influence was with the French utopian Christian philosophers like Chateaubriand. So there's a strong trend in what we call Western civilization, a term I hate, but of equality, of equitable treatment of people. And in terms of charity, of course there are strong traditions of charity in the West. You don't have vacuums like you have here, but you have private organizations and endowments, and some of the world's biggest philanthropists are hardcore capitalists, like the Prussians. So it's a different model in the United States, or a different culture, but I would argue not a different civilization. Not only do we have all these mixes of religions and cultures that Neil was talking about in Toronto, or in Vancouver, or more and more Chinese, or in Chicago, or New York, we don't just have the mix of peoples and cultures, but we have all these same basic concepts, but expressed in different ways, with different vocabulary, which can sometimes be religious, sometimes be cultural norms. But what we consider as good or civilized, I think, is common across these various cultural boundaries, or Huntington's clashed civilizations. So maybe the quest is to try to come up with those commonalities that the world tried to do with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I don't know if we really believe that, how universal it is. I happen to believe it should be universal. I think in every society there will be strongly different views about how free people are, whether it's in the United States where people suffer economic inequality, or in so-called Islamic cultures where there's great debate, right, over rights of women and over equitable treatment. So in all of our societies, I think we have a certain set of basic concepts that we need to work on. And to me, fundamentally, the real clash within all of these societies, or called civilizations, is that between the individual and the collective, no matter which society it is. And Matthew Arnold talked about this going back to the period even before Marx, right? I mean, there's a fundamental philosophical struggle and duality of duty in society between whether you empower the strongest, who then can hold society to the greatest heights, be it in knowledge or wisdom, scientific achievement, economic achievement, or do you try to take care of everyone and level out the differences, the often God-given differences between people's basic human endowments, and pursue equitable treatment of people as your main goal? I think there's no answer. I don't think Islamic so-called civilization or capitalist civilization does it better or worse. You have different cultures with different hybrid attempts. And look at the Scandinavian example, right? I mean, for years and years, the goal of Scandinavia was to, okay, have a fundamental capitalist base, but then even out the differences and have high tax rates, provide strong social services. In some Scandinavian countries, that remains norm. In others, I spent a lot of time in Finland, where I had a joint venture with a Finnish company, environmental technology company. People are fed up with it. Many people, the majority is fed up with it. They're saying we need to reform this system. We need a greater role for the individual. So I think history is fundamentally a struggle of individual rights versus the collective. And strong leadership, enlightened leadership, tries to find a way to take into account the cultural differences of each place, each country, and find the balance of both that's right. But going too far in one direction or the other leads to big problems.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, it's an interesting debate, of course. When I look at from my radical political economic perspective as well, it is very much the convergences that we had, whether we call them civilizations, but between different societies. Convergences took place, and as you mentioned, the hybridity of something that we have around us. I mean, when I go to Sultanahmet Mosque, which is considered to be one of the excellent points of Islam civilization, how much that is different from Hagia Sophia, which is, of course, an important Christian part of civilization that is presented. And therefore, making a lot of references to civilization and its role and shaping everyday, I think it is, I feel personally, it is terribly exaggerated reality. And the convergence is something, and we'll look at the market system. Whether you're Muslim in Istanbul, you're Christian in New York, or Hindu in Delhi, somehow market converged everyone together and act very much a similar way. With this addition, the guy will give zakat in Ramadan, the almsgiving, and the guy in New York will give to Oxfam. So again, in terms of perhaps behavioral norms, there isn't much difference, only the attached values. In the same way, a very capitalist brand, as my power of shame idea, would pay the penalty to pollute the environment. The same thing can happen with a very religious guy in Istanbul. So therefore, I think this kind of exaggeration, of course, owing to, I think, Fukuyama, the debate in the late 1990s in particular was important, and a lot of attention, and a lot of responses perhaps in a very defensive way from the Muslim side, very, very defensive. I didn't find it particularly productive, but anything has happened, and therefore the whole idea of the United Nations Civilization Alliance, Turkey and Spain, but that didn't take us to anywhere because we didn't have violence. It doesn't count. I don't want to go further, but perhaps I want to appeal to the audience if they have any questions. And particular questions to the audience, but comments are most welcome. But if there's any question on this civilizational debate, rather than be dominating here, anyone wants to take up? And any questions? We can use the microphone here, perhaps. There's a gentleman at the back that if you could identify, if you are directing your question to a particular person, if you could identify that as well, would be useful.
Mr. Tabak, I have two questions, one for Murat Hocam and one for Matthew. Murat Hocam, civilization works well as an analytical category, and its content, scope, the boundaries, and the criteria for inclusion and exclusion are quite ambiguous. So, on what grounds can we treat civilization as an empirical category to observe?
And for Matthew, I really wonder about your observations in the ground and what policymakers do with civilization in regional politics in South Caucasus. We know Turkey uses it in discursive level, but is there any other state using civilization as a tool to drive certain policies? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mr. So I could clarify what I really mean about this borders issue. And we can take defining these borders through the authenticity of the theoretical background of, if you are talking about Islamic civilization, also we have to talk about, besides this, Muslim civilization, because what the Muslims history have done do not need to be in line with Islam. So it's part of this civilization, but it's not part of this Islamic civilization. So we have, in political terms, for example, we theoretically all know that through the sayings of the Prophet, through the hadith, that he's not happy with the kingdom or sultanate essentially, but throughout the whole history of Islamic empires, kingdoms, we see the sultanate very easily. So then we have to differentiate between Islamic civilization through the authenticity and the values that it prescribes on the one hand, and also we have to take into account about this Muslim civilization in these political terms or something else. That's one side of it. And when we are talking about, through this example, this Islamic civilization, and it has different understandings that change from space and the time dichotomies. So right now, if you are in the age of nation states, and if you are still trying to accommodate yourself through this pre-modern times, when Islam was established and it came through the worst. For example, as we are talking about the zakat arms giving issue, shall we still keep calculating it as 140? I do not have a problem with that, because I will keep in mind that Ali, peace be upon him, has talked that it is the Scrooge arms scheme. But if you want, you can give more than this one side. Or when it comes to the, shall we still keep calculating it as the richness level through 81 gram of gold, approximately. But today, you could have 81 gram of gold, but it doesn't make you rich today in any society. So that we have to modify, and this is how we comment about. And even you can skip about that, and that's where the Muslim civilizations. And we can say to the same thing for Western civilization. As we are mentioning about this equality issue, women's rights, thanks to that. We are personally, I'm thankful for that, all this to the Western civilization, because we know that if you take it this Islamic way, in the last before his death in Mecca, Prophet has prohibited usually the interest rates. That's okay, but when it comes to the slavery, he wanted to finish it in time. But when it comes to this Declaration of Rights in the United States, and it is the first country that has abolished the slavery issue, at least in judicial terms. But it doesn't mean that still there is no slavery. Yes, there is still, we have de facto slavery. If you are working in any country in minimum wages, it's part of slavery. So yes, civilization is continuing. And just one more thing, I remember by listening to other speakers. When I started university, I didn't know the translation, and since I'm thinking in Turkish way of language, in Turkish inşaat mühendisliği, I thought it was construction engineering. And when you start the faculty, you learn that it is civil engineering. But in fact, in the Department of Political Science and Public Administration, if something to be called civilized, it should be my department, not this contractor engineers. So that is how you put the understanding of civilization. And when it comes to Turkey, we still understand when it comes to the civilization issue, besides being rude or being kind, it comes to this construction issue that we'll love to. I hope it could be a satisfying answer to your question.
Yeah, so Professor McFarland probably has some thoughts on the South Caucasus as well, which I always like to hear. Sorry to put you on the spot. Yeah, there are, I think, more cultural uses of culture in the South Caucasus, though there's, or maybe it's civilization. The boundaries of these definitions are quite blurred, but you asked about Iran. So Iran doesn't seem to gain much traction in the South Caucasus. The model that it offers is not appealing really to anyone that lives there. And I think that gets back to one of the points Mehmet was making earlier about capitalist civilization that is imposed. Well, it certainly was not imposed on the Georgians or Azerbaijanis. They are running toward Western civilization or capitalism as fast as they can get there in many cases, right? Just like Eastern Europeans did from the former Soviet Union. There's nothing imposed on them. They want it. So while Iran has limited scope of play, and it's been largely, up until the last couple of years, negative. I mean, it was stirring radicalism in southern Azerbaijan and parts of Baku as well, using cultural centers and business centers to do the same, to radicalize. That's shifted a bit now, and now there's more talk in Baku about a north-south axis in addition to the east-west one. North-south meaning Russia, Azerbaijan, and Iran, which in practical terms means physical infrastructure, road, rail, telecommunications, maybe some investment, but not so much investment. And then, as I said before, in the case of Armenia, Iran has been an important provider of energy, supplier of energy, but there's not a huge amount of economic activity. There's some. But the civilization model offered by Iran, whatever that is, doesn't seem so appealing. But to wrap up, definitely we're ever returning as the European, again, sorry, to the European civilizational model over capitalist. That is strongly appealing. And as I said in my remarks, the quest to become part of it has really motivated Georgia as a country and the government, whether it was the Saakashvili government or the current Georgian Dream Coalition, really motivated that country to undertake thoroughgoing reforms that have led to Georgia being, well, one of the leaders in having the least amount of corruption, I should say, anywhere, at least according to whoever compiles the statistics, and, you know, the ease of doing business that the World Bank compiles every year. That index always has Georgia near the top. So the appeal of capitalist civilization is quite strong for the Georgians, as well as for the Azerbaijanis, though to a lesser extent. So that is actually the influence and the power I think the European Union has in the South Caucasus. Thank you.
Share something? Since Matt focused on Turkey and Iran and the United States for the West, capitalism as a civilization force. Well, I'll leave my Marxism behind. I'll tell you that. But anyway, Russia, I think one can think about Russia in these terms. Certainly the Russians claim that they believe that they have a distinct civilization, and that this somehow gives them stewardship responsibilities in the Eurasian space, or at least the former Soviet part thereof. So the question really would be, does that have an attraction in the region? My view is no with the Azeris, clearly not with the Georgians, actually not with the Abkhaz, because they, you know, Russia for them is a strategic convenience in a rather nasty conflict with majoritarianism. That's it. And the Ossets, there's no traction there either, in the sense that what the Ossets really want to do is be part of Russia, or be part, I should say, of Alania, unified North and South Ossetia. As for Georgia and the West, I mean, there are many Georgians who are who genuinely believe that Georgia's past was as part of Europe, going back to when Georgian kings used to marry the daughters of French kings, whenever it was the 10th century. And on the other hand, there are also people who understand that there is a strategic interest in endorsing a Western agenda. If you feel that you are an exposed country with a historically rather difficult, large neighbor who has effectively taken control of two parts of your country, you need a Grisha, a roof. The roof is Europe, and Europe is the hope for potential for protection. So is that a value-based diplomacy, or is it a strategy for the Georgian leadership? These are not mutually exclusive. They appeal to different people to different degrees. I know lots of people in Georgia who actually appeal for integration. Not because they particularly embrace it, but because it's either good for business, it's good for aid flows, by the way, and it's good as a soft deterrent to the Russians.
Thank you very much. Rahman had a question.
Thank you very much, all of you. It was really enlightening session. But I have a sort of reservation. The question is about can we use the civilization as a unit of analysis? But after the question session, we all use the civilization as a way of analysis, actually. Our responses use a categorization of a culture, civilization, or automatically we use it as a unit of analysis, actually. On this course, not analytical level maybe, not academic way, but on this course we use it. So capitalist civilization, or the Eastern civilization, or the authoritarian way of Russian civilization, or the Islamic civilization, we actually qualify the concept of civilization with one more word. So when we say the Islamic civilization, it becomes Islamic civilization, or Western, or even we can say the Kurdish or Turkish civilization, if they got really huge influence or effective. So why, if we can't use the civilization concept, because the tendency, general tendency in this session has been, it's not a unit of analysis. So why can't we use it as a general or umbrella concept, including the subcultural identities in it, and use it in a flexible way, not the strict way of, for example, when we define ideologies, we say certain set of ideas. Okay, so why can't we define civilization as a general way of ideas? So maybe we enlarge the cover area of the civilization, but we can still use it, can't we? That's a general question. Thank you.
Okay, I don't want to, but perhaps you're responding to your own position by suggesting that there are cultural forms which brings together to create what they call the civilization. I mean, as I mentioned, when you go to a Javanese wedding, perhaps the nikah is made according to Islamic act, but when you look at the dress code, the behavioral norm is crazily Javanese. So, what is that? Is that Islamic civilization? And then, this is not demeaning, I'm just giving an example. But when you go to another culture, like Iran, the expression of that. So, and also in politics, I mean, we have seen, forget Islam, look at the Arabs, and within the Arab, forget that even about the GCC, look at the party. Okay? How even being a GCC Haliji doesn't help them to form how we can generalize. It's terribly difficult to generalize even Jews as Arab, out of the way they articulate policies, foreign policies, public policies, and so therefore it creates a terrible tension, and therefore perhaps in your answer you are giving the response as well. It's terrible, and perhaps therefore we have to be more careful as social scientists making such very broad generalization. In the same way that Weber, for instance, he made a generalization that Islamic civilization will not be able to generate capitalism, which, I mean, if you ask me, it shouldn't, but we have seen that, well, look at the GCC and survey, it has grown. It is very good generalization, and he was looking at only the Ottoman experience and making such a conclusion. And therefore, perhaps, as social scientists, we should avoid this very large generalization. Because if it is Islamic civilization or Christian civilization, then how can we have all these differences rather than very unified position within even small groups within the civilization? But having said that, that's my position. Can anyone wants to respond? Roger, would you like to respond?
This is asked me at the panel is slide by Mr. Gorbachev in Lyon. And when I look at some peculiar features of Islamic civilization, historian of civilization, Western civilization said, North Africa and also Middle East said, observation, some concrete examples, for example, the IEPAS system. All this is due to two verses from the Quran and saying of the Prophet Muhammad. It is the embodiment of this. And then I look at, I go over the studies on IEPAS constitution, which almost 26,000 IEPAS constitution. They have, all they have in the introduction of this constitution is two verses from the Quran and the saying of the Prophet. So the French historian says it is the embodiment of this hadith, this tradition. I just want to say very well-known hadith. It says, when a person dies, his actions come to an end, with three exceptions. Recurring charity, sadaqah jariyah, that is within a school, within a hospital, or road, or bridge, etc., from which the community derives continuous benefit. The community, not only the community derives continuous benefit. Knowledge from which benefit continues to be read, and prayers of his pious children for him or for her. This is why people, they put their money, their work in building buildings and systems in the Muslim civilization. I think this is one peculiar feature of we understand from what is the Islamic civilization is. Another example is I'm also interested in the dialogue of travelers in the Muslim land in 18th and 19th century. And one example is from the UK. It is Edward Lane, the traveler and also lexicographer. He spent 10 years in Cairo, and he wrote down everything. All his memoirs is available now. He says even the dogs of Cairo differentiate between a Christian and Muslim. Yes, it is there. Then he began to wear a Muslim, grab, because to protect himself from the attack of dogs in the night. The reason is that the Muslims have wattles from to feed the dogs and cats of Cairo, and the Christians they don't have. So the dogs know who is Christian and who is Muslim. They don't attack Muslims. And but when I said, I was presenting, the Islamic perception of animals, and there was a critique from a lady. I asked her, where are you from? She said, I'm from Cairo. Then he said, there is no sensitivity to animals, to environment in my country, and you are talking from a different planet. I said, you are right. No, I tell you something from your history, and you will say, I don't know. It is a part of our history, but we lost this history. But when we try to understand what we call it civilization, or as Ibn Khaldun says, it's Umran, it is, yes, there are some peculiar features also. Whenever Muslims travel, they also learn from them, as we say in Java. I also very surprised to see when I was in Indonesia, there also in South Asia, there are, for example, wherever you go in Turkey, nobody will pour, flowers on your head. That when I was in Pakistan and in India, or the Muslims, they welcomed me, and my wife is just like Hindus. They put, like Gandhi put something close on my neck. I just think, they are also the civilizations learning from each other. Yes, thank you.
Just very briefly. Okay. I'll start with the idea that whenever we've been using civilization on this panel, we can always attach an adjective. So, whatever, cinematic. It's a very good point for me because I thought similarly in thinking about capitalism. Capitalism is a category of economic system. It's a particular body of theory about economics. Why do we need to call it civilization? Religion, by the way, is a perfectly good noun. And by the way, generally speaking, people know what we're talking about when we're talking about religion. But when we start talking about religious civilization, it becomes very murky because because we don't actually have a settled view of what civilization is. I think there is one area in which, at least in discussing civilization and global politics, there is one area in which the word is useful, and that is in discursive analysis. People, you and I may not be able to say or agree what it is. People use it as an instrument of political discourse. And to the extent that they do use it that way, the impact is arguably measurable. I mean, what's the impact on the dependent variable of the Russian notion of Slavic civilization versus shooting somebody in the head? I mean, I don't know the answer to that, but that is a question that could be addressed. So discursively, it's like many different other categories of discourse, which are deployed for particular political purposes. They either work or they don't.
Personally, I have said that it would be a unit of analysis, civilization, but when your scope of analysis is work politics. So, if I don't misunderstand, I'm not in that category. Well, I do not want to act as devil's advocate, but I should now, while talking about this foundation issue in itself, well, historically, through the Ottoman history, since the higher bureaucrats, when they give up their job or retire, they are all assets after their death were confiscated. So in order to overcome this issue, to let their heirs to get the inheritance, and that they really had huge salaries, they were establishing foundations. So the board of these foundations were made up of their sons, daughters, and wives. As far as I know, two wives in classical Ottoman history in the early period, in the beginning and the rising, one in Bryza time and in one Mehmet second time. The foundations were abolished. So, as we say, it has grown up either feeding the dog, something like that. Yes, what is really part of the Islamic culture or Muslim culture, but also it was manipulated. So we have to keep this in attention. And since also Ibrahim has talked about this Indian issue, last year I was in Delhi for a conference, and they have taken us to a Muslim leader, Tom Eshaya, and it really made no sense for me, because watching the people are pouring the leaves of the roses, and they were putting a headscarf on it. It's just getting some story, something like that. And you get some citizens when you are doing a PhD, and since I studied this political economy, the very first thing that I ask is that who is making money out of it? In fact, I have seen it through the shops who are selling headscarves and roses. They were doing it, and my question was that are they taking back to their shops? So when we are talking about values, then we have to ask what is the material side of these values. Or even if we are talking about anything material like capitalism, we have to take this values issue, because capitalism is not just all bad idea, because it has this contract issue, this time management issue, that you have to put your service or your product on time. So we cannot just throw it to the garbage. Thanks.
Yeah, well, very briefly, this is a question there. I mean, I take Neil's point that we need terms to describe the world around us, however imperfect they are, but religion to me is particularly imperfect now. In fact, religion as a history term only emerged a couple of hundred years ago. Before 200 years ago, there were no religions in the world of any kind. Religion emerged as a term as secularism rose up, as science rose up. Science came up with the term religion as a way of describing certain forms of human behavior. And as secular states developed, scientific rationality developed during the 19th century, 20th century. Don't forget, in the 19th century, there were no disciplines like biology, chemistry. Charles Darwin, what did he read at university? He read theology. He was married to the daughter of one of the most famous vicars in the UK. At that time, there was no separation between biology and theology. That came much later. So religion only emerged as an idea, as a set of human behavior, very, very recently. My mother-in-law, for example, is a devout Roman Catholic. She doesn't consider herself religious. In fact, religious people don't consider themselves religious. That's a term given to her, a certain type of behavior. She's just living her life as a Roman Catholic. That's what she does. She gets up in the morning, she prays, she does farming, she's a farmer, and that's her life. So we need to be very careful and I think be quite critical of where these terms come from and really their kind of history.
Thank you. Time is an issue. There are two questions that you guys have to be very brief. Let's start with yourself and we'll come to you. Okay, you can take it then also. Very brief, please. All right. Time is an issue.
Thank you so much for this panel, actually. I really enjoyed and enlightened me. And also thanks for Cesar putting this conference here, because this is kind of like a place for Mevlana, who was asking for everyone to come, whoever they are. So basically, my question is, once I read something, but I don't remember the author, but it was from the Frankfurt School. He was just saying that, someone was saying that state and extra state can exist each other, referring to Nazism. Which means that basically if we take this analogy from this part, like state and extraordinary state, which means like people can live safely, but also Nazism is working. Civilization and uncivilized manner can work as well. So that's why sometimes when we are trying to understand this unit of analysis as civilization, we may have some problem. So basically, now I can take my question to Murat, because he was just telling about this schizophrenia in a society, because two people from the same society, one said that West is like that, the other was, okay, why don't we follow this? Actually, there was kind of like a discussion about in Turkey, in Turkish history, Westernization against West. So it means that sometimes if we can't define this kind of like a unit of analysis, we may have some problem. Don't you think that maybe all of you, this is kind of like a not dialectic relationship, maybe these things can be embedded within it, like civilization and uncivilization is embedded within one thing. So basically, sometimes that's why I had this discussion, because one of my friends said that when we are discussing, Turkey has like a Stockholm syndrome. I said, why? Because West tortured us. So West impeached, collapsed the Ottoman Empire, and then later on we take our bases to West. So how is it possible? So that's why he called this kind of like a behavior as like a Stockholm syndrome. So don't you think that this is like from this Frankfurt School analogy, civilization and uncivilization can work within it? So this is kind of like a not dialectical relationship. Maybe it's kind of like an embedded relation. Thank you so much.
Someone wants to respond to that?
And during my talk, as I have underlined, that as it demonstrates, in order to understand civilization, we have to take into the other, and this other is barbarian, but we don't need to demonize it. According to my opinion, we should take it as the construction of the other, not as enemy, not as demon, something we don't need to show it as ever. And that's the main thing that we have to put. And in fact, this is the essence of understanding in social sciences, because when constructing any identity, you have to formulate the other while you are explaining yourself. And when you look at all the civilizations, they do have this barbarian issue. For example, as we have talked about the Stockholm syndrome for Turkey or any other third world nationalism, even you can take it. Or you make, rather than Stockholm syndrome, you can take it this Hegelian slave metaphor issue. You have lost the war against the West, against the infidels, and in order to rise up, you have to imitate them until you adopt yourself to the new rules, and you have to put it. And there is no way out. And in such a era, following the end of the Ottoman rule, the ones who have established the Turkish Republic are the Ottoman Pashas, either civilian or they were the government, civilian or military bureaucrats. And they have seen that how this empire, how their state have collapsed, and that is why they have this syndrome, not to fall once again. And they have established this state under the ashes of. And in order to understand their mentality, well, history can show us a path through it. And through your question, what I need to say that we have to comprehend this jump space of this philosophical or social terminology, either civilization or culture. And there is always a tension in that, because when we are talking about culture, the very thing that comes to my mind is Kulturkampf, which is the war of the cultures. Or any culture will have it within itself too.
Thank you very much, also. But please be brief.
Thank you. I'm assistant professor at Istanbul 2990 University, Oğuzhan Göksel. I actually really enjoyed this roundtable because I'm a social constructivist at heart. I don't believe in this concept of civilization at all. I just see it as a very useful tool to teach the students. And just as Tim suggested, I use Huntington's works in that manner, you know, very intellectual lazy, but perfect for students. But what I noticed whenever I talk to students, undergrad students, and all over from the world, not just Turkey, my university have a number of students from Central Asia, Caucasia, Balkans, Middle East. Whenever I said to them, and when I teach social constructivism first, I start deconstructing civilization. Right? That's one of my first examples. But then I receive these shocked reactions. Oh, how can there be, you know, not a Turkish Islamic civilization? You know, many of these students have been very much shaped by this Turkish Islamic synthesis. So they have difficulty, you know, coming to terms with such a our academic look at these issues. But when I also listen to all this discussion, especially Murat Hoca's talk about schizophrenia, and especially that example, I loved it, Mehmet Akif's national anthem, in which he describes West as a one-eyed monster, one-toothed monster, and then Atatürk's obsession with Western modernity. What I see is, even though we, the academics, have sometimes, can easily deconstruct these notions, I think they do have an impact on the society. Many people seem to take it to their heart, and I think that's because in many countries like Turkey, our politicians, our elites, are obsessed with civilization. Okay, in Turkey, for instance, there's this culture camp between the Kemalists and conservatives. On the other hand, even before the Kemalists, let's call them secularists. It's been going on for 200 years, and Turkey is not unique. Iran, Egypt, and many other countries of the Muslim world have a similar obsession with civilization. And I think what we see is that these politicians, social engineers, like Kemal Atatürk, constantly try to impose certain understandings of civilization to their society through top-down, modernization programs, but they don't really, they do have an impact, but not to the level that they expect. And I think Turkey is now in another phase, the new Turkey phase. This time, the conservatives are in power, and they're as in the words of President Erdogan, they're trying to raise pious generations dedicated to authentic values, right? But just as I'm suspicious of Kemal Atatürk's success with the social engineering program based on this Western civilization, I'm very suspicious of the success of this new ongoing social program. So I just would like to take your insights on this. Thank you.
Anyone? We'll take that question. The gentleman.
My name is Gökhan Kaya. I am a master student at Eskişehir Osman Gazi University. I also did a presentation yesterday about the ideational roots of the concept civilization. I'm asking about now this vitalist and the particularist notion of the civilization apart from the universalist and progressivist views. When we talk, this particularistic and vitalist notion that we owe to anti-enlightenment figures in the history of thought. If you take it as an explanation tool to explain the social phenomena, isn't it cultural determinism that we do? Because it presents the mechanistic conception of the world determined by culture, which is a web of mystification that we don't even want, we are too shy to explain what it is. So it's my question.
Anyone wants to take that?
Thank you for that question. I'm sorry I missed your presentation. I was chairing. Civilizational discourse is cultural determinism. No. You might be surprised to hear me answer that, but as I said yesterday in my own talk, I would consider, to the extent that civilization exists as a factor in social scientific analysis, it is a structural factor. Structural factors could include, by the way, power, or class, or national culture, and it could be any one of a number of things. Admitting that or believing it is a structural factor that may constrain choice or shape choice in a particular way is not deterministic, because there are multiple other structural factors also impinging on the unit of analysis that might be pushing other ways. And in the midst of all of this, by the way, there is the question of individual agency. How much freedom does the agent have? Well, how much space does an agent have within structural constraints? But I don't think it's determining. If it were determining, and if it were correct, we would be in a very different world.
mean, I think, just to pick up on your point, I mean, I think the imagination, the imaginary category of civilization is potentially quite dangerous one, in a way. I mean, for the reasons I sort of set out, I mean, it tends to create artificial barriers between what are historically intertwined groups, cultures, if you like. So you hear civilization deployed a lot in the UK as an anti-immigration discourse. So somehow immigrants coming in from anywhere, really, are different. And it's that notion of difference which underpins a kind of a creation of an exclusive civilization of the UK and Western Europe, if you like. I mean, I think that potentially that's by a right-wing narrative, and it's very culturally determined. And I don't know if you've read Etienne Balibar, the French philosopher, on how the term culture is a reformulation of older racist discourses. So if you look at the British National Party's website, for example, it talks a lot about civilization as a neo-Nazi party, and that turn away from race and towards cultural markers, particularly, of course, Muslims, a particular target now across Europe. Back in the sort of 60s and 70s, it was black people. I mean, even in the 80s, really, the narrative was around, Caribbean immigrants coming in and organising gangs and being a threat to our security. And that's, moved on now to cultural markers. And I think my concern with this kind of civilizational narrative is that actually beneath that sits this kind of cultural determinism that I think you're alluding to as a reformation of older biological notions of identity and therefore racist stuff.
Violent explanations. Today we don't talk about racism, but we are talking about civilization.
Yeah, and the political right has adapted to new legislation. I mean, they're pragmatists, right? So it's now illegal in the UK. You couldn't have a magazine like Charlie Hebdo in the UK. It's illegal. You can't portray a black politician as a monkey and put it on the front of your magazine. You get locked up for that in the UK. So as that opportunity space for racism has narrowed away from biological markers, I mean, you used to have signs on the hotel windows saying no Irishmen, blacks, and dogs. And that was entirely legal. I mean, that's against the law now. So as that has developed, then people, the political right, have turned towards culture in a big way. And, you can read what, Edward Said predicted all this in Orientalism, right? The kind of culturalist, terminist way of viewing the other is all there in covering Islam and Orientalism.
I think just like to take up your point also. I see that there's a huge difficulty in the current government trying to define an identity. I mean, let's pick up what you said. So the symbol is used, Rabia, that's the Arabic word. The content of that is very Kemalist nationalist discourse, one flag, one country, blah, blah, etc. And then in the end producing a generation of out of our values, references for Islam. So Islam is being squeezed into a Kemalist nation state. So using the same parameters of Kemalism and Islamizing it with using the Rabia as a terminology, as a symbol, it just re-engineering the society for good use. So I don't think that, I don't expect any kind of result out of it. But we go into the same circles as has been repeated as you mentioned in this country. So even symbolically, it has a problem. In terms of discourse, it has huge problem. And also when we look at the notions of whatever I don't join the discourse of civilization, but whatever we have, if there is, it was very important. It came into the blending process important, as I was making reference. So, and the nature of it, even the Islamic term Medina is very much what your mother would have told you not to rule, okay? A civilized city. Okay? So therefore, it emerged through that process. And now the socially engineering a new generation, considering the previous generation failed, but using all these confused ideas of creating a new generation, I don't expect that we will end up this identity politics in Turkey, which determine, unfortunately, the nature of the working of this part of the society. Having said that, using my privilege as chair, so I think we have to bring this to the end. Thank you very much for your contribution and spending your Sunday here, listening a bunch of guys from different parts of the world. Thank you very much, and I'm grateful to our contributors here. It was enjoyable for me at this. I'm very skeptical, but learning different perspectives from different disciplines has been an important task. Thank you very much for everything. And I haven't assigned the task of giving the certificates. That's again a part of civilization in this part of the world. Okay, I have to do that. Thank you very much. You can make sure that you will eat. Yeah. Okay. Again, thank you. Even I can have to for myself. We are terribly late, so I'm not sure what is happening now. Is anyone will tell us? Is there anyone here? No. Okay. Just okay. So there's a lunch out there.
Mehmet hocam, ben sizi güveneceğim.
Okay. Okay, we have a half hour.
And there is another difficulty in our culture. They are the original people of Algeria, which is not our country. Yeah, that's right. The Berbers are so we have to identify principles. And we see the Berbers as inferior. So we have to find this conflict between us. And of course, there is a difficulty of such. French. But so when you concentrate on this, something that is the point. But my article is based on this conception of silence. Now the Eurasian is.
Ha, ben yollarım. Tamam. Nerede? Mail nerede? Şu. Değil mi? Yine bana düştü iş.
Rahman Hoca'na yazıyorsun. Şeyimize başlıyor. Geç gibiyiz bilince.
For example, you say escape is and then you psychologization is something not there is a sense of based on religion, there is a religion based on language. So what does for example, we are Arab and Arab. So I said Islamic tradition, I said Arabic. Which one is it?